James Richardson stared at his reflection in the mirror of his first-class airplane seat, adjusting his designer sunglasses with a smirk. At just 28 years old, he had everything most people could only dream of. A successful tech company, a mansion in Silicon Valley, and most importantly to him, fame. As his private flight to London cruised at 35,000 feet, he scrolled through his social media feed, admiring the numbers. 500,000 followers and growing. "Sir, would you like some more champagne?" the flight attendant asked, already holding a fresh bottle of Dom Perignon. "Keep it coming," James replied without looking up from his phone. He was too busy planning his next big viral moment. His previous pranks had made him an internet sensation, from releasing hundreds of rubber ducks in a luxury hotel pool to paying strangers to throw pie at each other in Times Square. Each video had brought him more followers, more attention, and more advertising deals. London had been calling his name for months. The city was perfect for what he called his content creation tour. His followers had been demanding bigger, older pranks, and James was determined to deliver. He had already mapped out potential locations: Trafalgar Square, the London Eye, and of course, Buckingham Palace. As he sipped his champagne, James opened his laptop and pulled up his bank account, 8 figures strong. Money had never been an obstacle for him, not since his app QuickShare had taken off 3 years ago. The simple file-sharing platform had caught the attention of major investors, turning him into a millionaire practically overnight. But it wasn't enough. The money was nice, but the fame was what he really craved. The flight attendant returned with more champagne, this time accompanied by a small plate of caviar. James barely touched the food, too engrossed in watching his old prank videos. His favorite was the one where he hired a mariachi band to follow a confused Wall Street executive for an entire day. That video had gotten him his first million views. Losing altitude for our descent into London Heathrow, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. James looked out his window at the sprawling city below. Somewhere down there, his next viral moment was waiting to happen. His phone buzzed with a message from his content manager, Sarah. "Remember, we need something huge for London. The numbers have been flat lately." James frowned at the message. She was right. His last few pranks hadn't performed as well as expected. A guy pretending to propose to random women in Central Park. Done before. Starting a fake flash mob in a grocery store. Ancient history. He needed something that would shock people, something that would make headlines. The plane touched down smoothly at Heathrow Airport. As James stood up to retrieve his Louis Vuitton luggage from the overhead compartment, he caught sight of his reflection again. The designer clothes, the perfectly styled hair, the confident smile. He had crafted his image carefully. His followers didn't just watch his videos, they wanted to be him. A private car was waiting for him outside the airport. Black, sleek, and expensive, just the way he liked it. The driver, an older man named William, greeted him with a practiced smile. "Where to, Mr. Richardson?" "The Ritz," James replied, not looking up from his phone. He was already drafting ideas for his London content. The comments were pouring in. "Show those stuck-up Brits how we do it in America. Do something crazy at the Palace. Make it bigger than ever." The car glided through London's streets, passing iconic landmarks that James barely noticed. His mind was racing with possibilities. He needed something that would top everything he'd done before. Something that would make the whole world talk about him. As they passed Buckingham Palace, James finally looked up from his phone. The sight of the Queen's guards in their ceremonial uniforms caught his attention. They stood perfectly still, faces expressionless, following centuries of tradition. "Hey, William," James called to his driver. "What's the deal with these guards? Are they really not allowed to move?" "That's correct, sir," William replied. "It's a matter of duty and honor. Those uniforms they wear are worth thousands of pounds, and the tradition goes back hundreds of years." James leaned back in his seat, a small smile playing on his lips. Something was forming in his mind, a plan that would surely get him millions of views. But first, he needed to check into his hotel, meet with his local videographer, and most importantly, celebrate his arrival in London with more champagne. Little did James know that his pursuit of viral fame was about to lead him down a path that would change his life forever, and not in the way he imagined. The next morning, James woke up in his £2,000 per night suite at the Ritz with a mild headache and an unshakable desire for attention. His first night in London had been exactly what you'd expect from a young millionaire. Endless bottles of champagne at an exclusive club called Platinum, where he'd thrown money around like confetti. Another day, another viral opportunity, he mumbled to himself, checking his phone. His latest Instagram story, just showing him popping bottles at the club, had already gotten 100,000 views. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. The hotel room's phone rang. It was Marcus, his local videographer, hired specifically for the London trip. "I'm downstairs, ready when you are," Marcus said, his London accent thick with anticipation. James had promised him double his usual rate for capturing something extraordinary. James dressed quickly, choosing his favorite Gucci jacket and designer sunglasses. His head was still spinning from last night's champagne, but a new idea had been forming in his mind since passing Buckingham Palace. Those guards, standing so still, following those ancient rules, they were the perfect targets. "Let's grab breakfast first," James told Marcus as they met in the hotel lobby. "I need to tell you about my plan." They found a quiet corner in an upscale cafe near the palace. James stirred his third espresso of the morning, his eyes darting around to make sure nobody could overhear them. "So here's what I'm thinking," he leaned in, speaking in a low voice. "Those palace guards, they're not allowed to move, right? No matter what happens." Marcus nodded slowly, a look of concern crossing his face. "Yeah, but mate, they're not just for show. They're real soldiers." James waved his hand dismissively. "That's what makes it perfect. Imagine the views we'll get. I'm thinking something colorful, something that'll really pop on camera." He pulled out his phone and started searching for art supply stores nearby. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but didn't say anything. The money was too good to pass up. As they finished their breakfast, James's phone buzzed again. It was Sarah, his content manager. "Need something big today. Followers are getting bored." That message strengthened his resolve. He needed this. His followers needed this. The numbers had to keep growing. They found an art supply store just a few blocks from the palace. James walked straight to the paint section, his eyes scanning the shelves until he found what he was looking for: bright red paint, the kind that would show up perfectly on camera. "This is perfect," he said, grabbing the largest can available. The store clerk raised an eyebrow as James checked the label, but said nothing as he rang up the purchase. Outside the store, Marcus tried one last time to change James's mind. "Look, mate, I've seen those guards up close. They're not just standing there for tourists, they're protecting the palace." But James wasn't listening. He was already imagining the headlines. "Tech millionaire pranks Queen's Guard." His followers would go crazy. The video would be everywhere. They walked toward the palace, the can of paint hidden in a designer shopping bag. James could feel the excitement building in his chest. This would be his biggest prank yet. "Let's get a drink first," James suddenly announced, spotting a pub. "Need to calm my nerves." One drink turned into 3, then 5. With each glass of expensive scotch, James's judgment became more clouded, but his confidence soared. Marcus watched nervously as his client became increasingly animated, talking about how this video would break the internet. By early afternoon, James was ready. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and tourists were gathering around the palace gates. The sun was high in the sky, perfect lighting for what he had planned. "Get your camera ready," James told Marcus, his words slightly slurred. "This is going to be epic." Marcus positioned himself across the street, his professional camera hidden among the tourists' phones and cameras. James stood near the guard post, the shopping bag with paint clutched tightly in his hand. His heart was racing, but not from fear, from anticipation. The guard standing at his post was absolutely still, his red uniform pristine, his black bearskin hat perfectly positioned. James looked at him and saw not a soldier performing his duty, but a prop in his next viral video. As the ceremony began and the crowds grew larger, James checked his phone one last time. Sarah had sent another message. "Whatever you're planning, make it count." James smiled, his hand tightening around the bag containing the paint. In his champagne and scotch-addled mind, this was going to be his masterpiece. He had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The changing of the guard ceremony was in full swing, with hundreds of tourists holding up their phones and cameras to capture the historic moment. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as the guards performed their precise ceremonial movements. Thomas Wells, the Queen's Guard member standing at his post, was focusing on maintaining his stoic position. At 35 years old, with 15 years of distinguished military service, he took immense pride in his duty. Beneath the ceremonial uniform was a decorated soldier who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan. The bearskin hat and red uniform weren't just for show, they represented centuries of tradition and honor. James swayed slightly as he moved closer to Wells's position, the alcohol clouding his judgment. Marcus stood across the street, his camera rolling, though his hands were shaking. He had a bad feeling about what was about to happen. "This is going to be insane," James muttered to himself, reaching into the shopping bag. The crowd's attention was focused on the main ceremony, giving him the perfect opportunity. With unsteady hands, he removed the lid from the paint can. Time seemed to slow down as James lifted the can above his head. A few nearby tourists noticed him and started pointing, some already beginning to record with their phones. But before anyone could react, James tipped the can. The bright red paint cascaded down, splashing over Wells's immaculate uniform. The thick liquid seeped into the wool tunic, dripped down the ceremonial rifle, and pooled at his polished boots. The bearskin hat, worth thousands of pounds alone, was completely soaked. For a split second, there was absolute silence. Then chows erupted. Wells, trained to maintain his position no matter what, stood perfectly still as the paint dripped down his face. But the burning sensation in his eyes told him this wasn't just regular paint, it contained chemicals that were causing an immediate reaction. The crowd gasped collectively. Phones were now pointed at James and the paint-covered guard, recording every second. James, still drunk on alcohol and the anticipation of viral fame, actually started laughing. That laugh was cut short as two police officers, who had been monitoring the ceremony, sprinted toward him. At the same time, several palace security members emerged from their positions. "It's just a prank," James shouted, still holding the empty paint can. "It's for my channel." The police officers reached him first. One of them tackled him to the ground while the other kicked away the paint can. James' expensive designer clothes were now covered in dirt and paint as he was forced face down onto the pavement. Meanwhile, other guards had broken protocol to assist Wells. The paint was causing visible irritation to his exposed skin, and his eyes were beginning to swell. A medical team was immediately called. Marcus, still filming from across the street, couldn't believe what he was watching through his lens. This wasn't a prank, it was assault. He slowly lowered his camera, already knowing this footage would likely become evidence rather than entertainment. The crowd's initial shock had turned to anger. Tourists who moments ago had been happily taking photos were now shouting at James as the police handcuffed him. Someone in the crowd recognized him and shouted, "That's the YouTube prankster, James Richardson." Wells was finally allowed to move from his position and was quickly escorted inside the palace grounds for medical attention. The ceremonial uniform, soaked in paint, was completely ruined. Later examination would reveal that the paint contained industrial-grade chemicals that caused second-degree burns on Wells's face and neck. As James was led away by the police, the reality of what he'd done began to penetrate his alcohol-fogged mind. His phone had fallen from his pocket during the tackle, and he could see it lighting up with notifications. His prank was already spreading across social media, but not in the way he had hoped. The ceremony was temporarily halted, something that hadn't happened in decades. Tourists were ushered away from the immediate area as palace staff began cleaning up the paint. The red stains on the pavement would serve as a reminder of the incident for weeks to come. In the back of the police car, James's bravado finally crumbled. Through the window, he could see news vans already arriving at the scene. His head was pounding, and the handcuffs were uncomfortably tight around his wrists. The police officers in the front seat were discussing charges: assault, vandalism of royal property, disrupting a royal ceremony. As the police car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, James had no idea that this was just the beginning of his troubles. His pursuit of viral fame had just earned him something very different: international infamy and a date with the British justice system. Within hours of the incident, James Richardson sat in a cold interrogation room at the Westminster Police Station. His designer clothes were still stained with paint, and his hands trembled as the effects of alcohol wore off, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" Detective Inspector Sarah Collins asked, her voice stern as she laid out photographs of the incident on the metal table. The images, already pulled from social media, showed the paint hitting Wells, the guard's stoic stance even as chemicals burned his skin. James stared at the photos, his social media influencer confidence completely shattered. His phone and passport had been confiscated, and he had no idea that outside, his action was creating a global firestorm. In the hospital across town, Thomas Wells was receiving treatment for chemical burns. The doctors had identified the paint as containing industrial-grade solvents, which had caused second-degree burns on his face, neck, and hands. His wife, Emma, sat beside his hospital bed, holding his unbandaged hand while their two young children waited anxiously in the hallway with their grandmother. Meanwhile, at New Scotland Yard's press briefing room, Chief Superintendent Michael Barrett addressed a packed crowd of journalists. "This was not a prank," he stated firmly. "This was a deliberate assault on a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces performing his ceremonial duties. The suspect is in custody, and we are treating this with the utmost seriousness." The news spread like wildfire. Every major news channel in Britain ran the footage on loop. The BBC's breaking news alert reached phones across the country. American tech millionaire attacks Queen's Guard with chemical paint. Back in Silicon Valley, James's company board called an emergency meeting. The video had gone viral, but not in the way James had hoped. Hashtag James Richardson disgrace was trending worldwide, and the company's stock price was already dropping. Sarah, James's content manager, sat in her San Francisco office, watching her phone explode with notifications. Brands were frantically emailing to terminate their sponsorship deals with James. His social media accounts were flooded with millions of angry comments from around the world. In the police station, James was finally allowed to make one phone call. His hand shook as he dialed his lawyer's number in California. "James," his lawyer's voice was grave. "Don't say anything else to anyone. I'm arranging for a local British legal team, but this is serious. The guard has been hospitalized with chemical burns. They're talking about pressing terrorism charges due to the location and nature of the attack." The word terrorism hit James like a bucket of ice water. He slumped in his chair as Detective Collins returned with more officers. "Mr. Richardson," she said, "we've received word that the Crown Prosecution Service wants to proceed with immediate charges. You'll be held at Her Majesty's Prison Wandsworth while awaiting your court date." Outside the police station, a crowd had gathered. News cameras filmed as James was led to a secure transport vehicle. His face, once confident and smirking in his prank videos, was now pale and frightened. At Buckingham Palace, the paint-stained ground had been cleaned, but tourists continued to take photos of the spot where it happened. Palace officials released a statement. "We are deeply disturbed by today's assault on a serving member of the Queen's Guard. This attack shows a profound disrespect for our traditions and, more importantly, for the safety of our service personnel." Social media platforms began taking action. YouTube suspended James's channel for promoting dangerous behavior. Instagram and TikTok followed suit. His millions of followers watched as his online presence crumbled in real time. In his hospital room, Wells received a visit from his commanding officer, who informed him that the palace would cover all his medical expenses and that he would receive a commendation for maintaining his position despite the assault. As night fell over London, James was processed into Wandsworth Prison. His designer clothes were exchanged for a prison uniform, his luxury watch and rings stored away with his other possessions. In his small cell, the reality of his situation finally hit him full force. His phone, now in police evidence, continued to receive messages. His parents in California had seen the news and were desperately trying to reach him. His company board had emailed to inform him of an emergency shareholders meeting. News organizations worldwide wanted statements. But James couldn't see any of it. He sat on the hard prison bed, his head in his hands, finally understanding that his pursuit of viral fame had just destroyed everything he had built. And this was only the beginning of his consequences. The courtroom at the Old Bailey fell silent as James Richardson, wearing a plain gray suit instead of his usual designer clothes, stood before the judge. It had been 3 weeks since the paint incident, and his appearance had changed dramatically. Gone was the perfectly styled hair and confident smirk. Instead, dark circles under his eyes revealed sleepless nights in Wandsworth Prison. Judge Victoria Montgomery looked down at him from her elevated position, her expression stern as she reviewed the charges. Assault causing actual bodily harm, vandalism of royal property, disrupting a royal ceremony, and causing public nuisance. In the public gallery, Thomas Wells sat with his family, his face still showing signs of healing from the chemical burns. The guard's story had touched the nation's heart. A decorated veteran who had maintained his position even as burning paint ran down his face. "Your Honor," James' expensive British lawyer began, "my client wishes to plead guilty to all charges and express his deepest remorse for his actions." The prosecutor, Crown Counsel Edward Matthews, stood up with a thick folder of evidence. "The Crown would like to present the extensive damage caused by Mr. Richardson's actions," he announced. Not only did he cause physical harm to Mr. Wells, but the ceremonial uniform, worth £10,000, was completely destroyed. The bearskin hat, which dated back several generations, is irreplaceable. The court watched video footage from multiple angles, including Marcus's professional recording, which had been seized as evidence. James couldn't bear to look at the screen, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor as his moment of drunken stupidity played out before the court. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, "Mr. Wells suffered second-degree chemical burns requiring ongoing medical treatment. The psychological impact on his young children, who witnessed their father's injuries, cannot be understated." James' lawyer presented character witnesses via video link from Silicon Valley, but their testimony seemed hollow against the weight of evidence. Even his parents, speaking from California, couldn't explain away their son's actions. During a break in proceedings, James sat in a holding cell, listening to his lawyer explain the likely outcomes. "The judge seems inclined to make an example of you," the lawyer warned. "This case has attracted international attention." Back in the courtroom, Judge Montgomery asked James if he wished to address the court. His hands trembling, James stood up. "I am deeply ashamed of my actions," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I did was not a prank, it was assault. Mr. Wells, I cannot apologize enough for the pain I caused you and your family. My pursuit of social media fame led me to completely lose touch with reality and human decency." The judge listened impassively before beginning her ruling. "Mr. Richardson, your actions represent a disturbing trend in modern society, the pursuit of internet fame at any cost. You assaulted a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, disrespected centuries of tradition, and caused physical harm for nothing more than social media attention." The sentence came down hard: 6 months in prison, £50,000 in fines, and £25,000 in compensation to Thomas Wells. Additionally, James was banned from entering the United Kingdom for 10 years after serving his sentence. As the judge delivered the sentence, reporters in the gallery frantically typed on their phones, sending updates to news desks worldwide. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, many holding signs condemning James's actions. James' lawyer quickly filed paperwork to have him serve his sentence in a lower security facility, but the damage to his reputation was beyond repair. As he was led back to the cells, he caught a glimpse of Wells and his family leaving the courtroom. The guard walked with dignity, his head held high, while James shuffled away in handcuffs. In his cell that night, James received news that made his legal troubles seem almost minor in comparison. His company's board had voted unanimously to force his resignation. The company's value had plummeted by 40% since the incident, and major investors were pulling out. His lawyer also informed him that all his major sponsorship deals had been permanently terminated. Brands wanted nothing to do with him. His verified status on all social media platforms had been revoked, though he couldn't access them anyway from prison. As James lay on his prison bed that night, the full impact of his actions finally sank in. His wealth, fame, and reputation, everything he had spent years building, had been destroyed in less than a minute of reckless behavior. And this was still not the end of his downfall. More consequences were yet to come. 3 months into his prison sentence, James Richardson sat in the prison's communal area, staring at a newspaper that detailed the complete collapse of his professional life. The headline read, "Disgraced tech millionaire's company files for bankruptcy." QuickShare, the file-sharing platform he had built from scratch, was being sold off piece by piece. The company's value had plummeted from $200 million to barely $5 million in the months following his arrest. Owed James's reckless leadership style. "Another letter for you, Richardson. a guard announced, dropping an envelope on his table. It was from his accountant in California. As James read the contents, his hands began to shake. His net worth, once hovering around $50 million, had crashed to less than $500,000. Legal fees, fines, compensation payments, and the collapse of his company had wiped out almost everything. In Silicon Valley, Sarah, his former content manager, was giving a damaging interview to a tech magazine. James was obsessed with numbers, followers, likes, views. He'd do anything for attention, and we all saw this coming. We just didn't think it would be this bad. The venture capital firms that had once backed him were now distancing themselves completely. James's name had become toxic in the tech industry. Articles about him appeared in business schools as case studies of how quickly success could be destroyed by poor judgment. His phone number, email, and social media accounts had been leaked online, leading to thousands of hate messages. Internet sleuths had dug up every questionable thing he'd ever done, creating compilation videos of his most offensive pranks. Commentary channels on YouTube had made dozens of videos analyzing his downfall, with titles like The Complete Destruction of James Richardson. In his prison cell, James received another piece of bad news. His landlord in Silicon Valley had evicted him from his luxury mansion, citing a morality clause in the lease agreement. All his belongings had been put in storage, and the storage fees were mounting. The tech industry's response was particularly brutal. Major conferences removed him from their past speaker lists. Awards he had won were rescinded. Former colleagues pretended they had never known him. Even his college removed his name from their alumni success stories. One afternoon, during his allowed computer time in the prison library, James discovered that his story had become a cautionary tale. Teachers were using his case to educate students about social media responsibility. Parents referenced his downfall when warning their children about the dangers of seeking internet fame. His lawyer visited with more devastating news. The major brands that had sponsored his content were suing him for breach of contract and damage to their reputation. His legal bills were mounting, and his remaining assets were being drained rapidly. "It's not just the money," his lawyer explained. "Your reputation in the tech industry is completely destroyed. No serious company will hire you or work with you. You might want to consider a complete career change when you get out." The prison psychiatrist noticed a marked change in James's behavior. The once confident tech millionaire now barely spoke during group sessions. He spent most of his time writing in a journal, documenting his regrets and attempts to understand where he had gone wrong. One day, he received a letter from Marcus, the videographer who had filmed the paint incident. Marcus had been questioned by police but was cleared of any wrongdoing. His letter was brief but impactful. "I should have tried harder to stop you. We all got caught up in the views and likes and forgot about basic human decency." James's parents had to sell their retirement home to help pay for his mounting legal fees. Their son's face was now regularly featured in documentaries about social media addiction and the dangers of influencer culture. They could barely go grocery shopping without someone recognizing them as the parents of that guy who attacked the Queen's Guard. Technical conferences began using his story in their ethics panels. The Richardson effect became a term for when social media influence led to catastrophic personal and professional consequences. As his prison sentence continued, James received notice that his remaining investments had been liquidated to pay for the civil lawsuits against him. The millions he had earned through brand deals, sponsorships, and his tech company were gone. His net worth was now negative due to outstanding legal fees and loan payments. Sitting on his prison bed, James looked at a crumpled photo of himself from just 6 months ago, standing proudly in front of his mansion, showing off his luxury car and designer clothes. That person felt like a stranger now. His pursuit of viral fame had cost him everything, and his story wasn't over yet. 1 year after the paint incident, James Richardson sat at his small desk in a dimly lit support office in Minnesota. His dual monitors displayed customer service tickets instead of social media metrics, and his once designer wardrobe had been replaced by simple khakis and button-down shirts from Target. After serving his 6-month sentence and paying all fines, James had tried returning to California, but Silicon Valley had completely shut him out. No tech company would touch him, and his former industry connections pretended not to know him when he reached out. With his parents now living in a small apartment due to helping pay his legal fees, he had to start completely fresh in a new state. "James, can you help with a printer issue on floor 3? His supervisor called out. He nodded quietly and stood up. At 29, he was starting over at an entry-level support position, earning $40,000 a year, less than what he used to spend on a single night out in his previous life. His new coworkers knew about his past. It was impossible to hide given the numerous documentaries and news stories, but they mostly left him alone. Some even appreciated how his story had helped their own children understand the dangers of social media obsession. During his lunch break, James checked his personal email on his basic smartphone. His latest iPhone had been sold to pay legal fees. There was a message from Thomas Wells, the guard he had assaulted. Wells had agreed to let James speak at military schools about respect, responsibility, and the consequences of thoughtless actions. It was part of James' ongoing attempt at redemption. His tiny studio apartment was a far cry from his former Silicon Valley mansion. The walls were decorated with simple motivational posters, and his only furniture was from second-hand stores. But there was one frame that stood out, his first paycheck from the job, representing his new start. That evening, James attended his regular social media addiction support group. He hadn't posted anything online in over a year, and his former accounts remained suspended. In the group, he often shared his story with others struggling with the pursuit of online fame. I had 500,000 followers, he told a young influencer seeking help. Now I have real friends instead, maybe only 5 of them, but they actually care about me, not my content. His parents, though still struggling financially, had begun to rebuild their relationship with him. His mother had told him something that stuck. "We're prouder of who you are now, working an honest job and taking responsibility, than we ever were of your millions." James had also started volunteering at local schools, sharing his cautionary tale. Students were often surprised to see how ordinary he looked now. No designer clothes, no flashy accessories, just a regular person who had learned difficult lessons. "Your whole life can change in less than a minute," he would tell them, showing the infamous paint video. "I thought views and likes were more important than human dignity. I was wrong." One Saturday morning, James received an unexpected email from Sarah, his former content manager. She was producing a documentary about the dark side of influencer culture and wanted to interview him. Instead of asking for payment or attention, James agreed to participate for free, seeing it as another chance to prevent others from making his mistakes. His bank account, once filled with millions, now held a modest savings of $3,000, 3 months of careful budgeting from his salary. But for the first time in his life, he felt honest pride in his earnings. During his lunch breaks, James worked on writing a book about his experience, not for fame or money, but as therapy and a warning to others. The working title was simple: The Price of Views. How I Lost Everything Chasing Internet Fame. The final blow to his old life came when he received notice that all of his remaining QuickShare shares, once worth millions, had been declared worthless as the company finally dissolved. But instead of devastation, James felt relief. It was truly the end of his old life. As he walked home from work that evening, passing people absorbed in their phones and social media, James reflected on his journey. He had lost millions in money and followers, but he had gained something he never had before: peace with himself. In his small apartment, James opened his journal and wrote, "1 year ago, I thought losing everything would kill me. Instead, it saved me. Sometimes, rock bottom is the foundation on which you rebuild your life." The former tech millionaire turned support specialist went to sleep that night knowing that while this viral moment had lasted only seconds, its lessons would guide him for the rest of his life.